welcome back from the break, everybody. Hope you're all adequately refreshed and bathroomed, if that's what you call it. So up next, we have the wonderful Hattie and Andrea Langlois. I love how you say your surname. This is so poetic. So Hattie is also a director at Breaking Convention. I feel like I'm repeating myself today with that. But not only that, she is an ethnobotanist, has been a drug policy activist with over 20 years working with psychedelics. She has worked with the Beckley Foundation, with ICES to promote evidence-based drug policies and challenge obstructions to scientific research and development. She was also an ibogaine treatment facilitator to many years prior to becoming a mother, and also with her current work that she's doing now. And Andrea is a social alchemist, communicator and community-based researcher, and is passionate about social transformation, plant medicines and the community. For the last 5 years, she has been the Director of Engagement at the International Centre for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service, that's ICES. Many of you may have heard of ICES already. And you're currently co-leading assessments on the biocultural sustainability of ayahuasca and iboga. We're going to be taking more questions from the audience for this one. So have any questions prepared. It's more of a kind of fireside chat interactive session. So over to you, lovely ladies. Here you go.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's really great to be here at a real life in-person event, the first for ages. Okay, that's better. Right. The first psychedelic event for ages. And I'm particularly excited to be sharing the stage with Andrea, friend and colleague, who I'm normally communicating with over Zoom across time zones because she usually resides in Canada. So we're particularly lucky to have her here in the UK. Andrea and I are going to talk about what we think constitutes good medicine and sacred medicine. And we're going to use Indigenous principles as signposts, the 3 R's: reciprocity, respect, and right relationship. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more a bit later. But for now, I just want to sort of introduce us briefly and how we got to this journey and why we're sitting up here together. So Andrea and I have been working for ICES, as Amy said, on really looking at sort of potential paths forward for plant psychedelics via a kind of crowdsourcing initiative and mapping the psychedelic ecosystem and talking to all the stakeholders, or as many stakeholders as possible, to see where we want to go. Andrea has been focused more on biological and cultural sustainability, and I've been with a particular eye to ayahuasca and iboga. And I've been looking more broadly at drug policy reform and how we can legally and ethically integrate plant psychedelics into countries that they're not indigenous to. So my work has taken me really to the Americas and looking at cannabis reform to find out what's worked and what hasn't, and who benefited and who got shafted. And I guess, like Ali said at the beginning, psychedelics are in their heyday at the moment. And with psilocybin and MDMA being made breakthrough therapies, it's really only a matter of time before psychedelics become legally available to everyone. And the field is expanding really fast. Lots of money is pouring in. Oh, the mic sounds a bit funny. Is that all right?
You said money. She said money and it went weird.
And everything went weird. It's actually also really strange because I can't see any of you. The lights are so bright, I feel like I almost need to wear sunglasses. But anyway, the field is expanding really dramatically, and we want to sort of find ways to steer it forward, in a way that's going to be ethical and sustainable and really honor the indigenous cultures that have gone before us and who have stewarded and worked with these plants for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Andrea.
Thank you so much. First, express my gratitude to Breaking Convention. It's just such a delight to be here with everyone in person. And also to situate myself, I'm from the west coast of Canada. It's a country that's been in a deep and long process of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And so I approach this topic with cultural humility And I've learned through exploration, through talking to many people. I want to particularly note the union of Médicos and Viajeros de Colombia, UMIAC, who we've been in a deep process of what we call co-cultural or co-capacity building, and they have taught me so much and vice versa. And I had the joy of speaking with Ricardo Vitale yesterday to just really check out some of the concepts bringing forward today. So just deep gratitude to these friends and colleagues. And so I'm obviously not Indigenous. I think it's really important that non-Indigenous, non-people of color also bring some of these issues to the forefront. It's not comfortable, but neither are psychedelics. It's really about surrendering into the journey of what really is a kind of disruption of the way things are. And so our question that we put forward today is, what is good medicine? What makes good medicine? There's a lot of shadows, a lot of difficulties, big questions we have around the medicalization of psychedelics and how things are moving forward. And I'm really a fan of flipping things on their heads to think, what's the good that I'm looking for? Or as Alexander said this morning, what is sacred? And so we're going to be exploring this question. And also, as we heard this morning, we're in a situation of meta-crisis. I feel like the issue of how to have good medicine and good healing at this time is of crucial importance. It's not, we can't be flippant and think about, the amount of depression, mental illness, climate chaos, where we are as a species, and not actually look deeply at what does it take to heal. And so we're going to explore some of the principles of what does it look like to heal. And what I think is really just so beautiful, the presentation before ours, is we, through the eyes of the Huichol, through the Waivararica, we got to see a cultural system in process with medicine and deep reciprocity with the earth. And these people, whether Colombia, Gabon, Mexico, other places who've been using these traditional medicines, working in relation with them for many, many years, have somehow survived 500 years of colonization and cultural genocide through the help of these medicines. And so when we reduce them to molecules and active components or set and setting, I truly believe we're missing something. And so my encouragement and the practice I'm engaged in is deep listening. What can we actually learn from these cultures about how to sustain ourselves as humans in balance with the earth? And so, as Hattie said, we're going to be exploring this topic of how to make good medicine, how to have sacred medicine through these principles. We don't want to appropriate the principles of respect, responsibility, reciprocity. They are Indigenous principles, but we will be using them as signposts for our own exploration. And so a bit of what you're witnessing is a long, ongoing dialogue that Hattie and I have been involved in. We don't have the answers, but we're going to give you a little insight into some of the conversations we've been having. So over to Hattie to explore relationality through the eyes of an ethnobotanist.
Yeah, okay, so these ideas of reciprocity and respect and right relations didn't really come to me for a long time, if I'm totally honest. I've traveled around the world when I was quite a bit younger and sat with various Indigenous groups and received a lot of medicine, and didn't really get into this whole idea of how do I maintain the balance between receiving and giving back and keep it in circular motion. Not really until I started studying ethnobotany and I did my ethnobotanical training. And with that, I suddenly saw that really Indigenous knowledge has been central to the psychedelic movement since its inception. And I would really be surprised if any of you in this audience and anyone listening hasn't been touched or learned from an experience with Indigenous people or Indigenous knowledge. And I think if we're receiving in any way, be that individually or financially or professionally, we have to think about how we're maintaining the balance of receiving and giving. And when I studied ethnobotany, the focus was kind of on right relationship. And when you work with Indigenous people and you go out into the field, there's a really great and strict code of ethics that you have to adhere to. And that involves considerable prior informed consent and access and benefit sharing agreements. And you can't even begin your work without really going through a process of considering all that. And I think, and now we have these conventions, obviously we have the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, all of which are trying to uphold this and basically stop the exploitation of indigenous knowledge and access to their natural resources without fair benefit sharing. But somehow in this psychedelic science and in this, this boom we're experiencing, this has been forgotten. And really, ethnopharmacology and psychedelic research are very similar, but ethnopharmacology has this strong code of ethics that I think somehow has just been ignored or isn't being adequately considered at the moment in the scientific field. And I want to kind of take us back a bit to the situation, my mic, hold on, to really how this kind of all started, especially if we look at the development of psilocybin therapies. There's a very clear lineage back to the Mazatec people. People can say, and I listened to a podcast recently, and a CEO of one of these big companies said, but we've had mushrooms here in Europe and the Americas for ages, and so we don't really have to worry about that indigenous piece too much. Well, yeah, sure, we've had mushrooms, but the living culture wasn't thriving at the time that psychedelic science was emerging. And in the 40s and 50s, when people were getting interested in psychedelics for research purposes, there was zero interest in psilocybin until Gordon Wasson went out to Huautla de Jimenez and published his piece of his mushroom Veleda with Maria Sabina, who's now an infamous mushroom shaman. That was in 1957, and a couple of years later, mushroom tourism was starting in Huautla de Jimenez, and Albert Hofmann had extracted, isolated, and synthesized psilocin and psilocybin, and Sandoz, the lab he was working with at the time, patented this extraction and synthesis process along with psychedelic tranquilization in the form of a psilocybin pill that they labeled indicybin. And there was no reference back to the Mazatec people, and they weren't brought to the table in any shape or form. And the story there with Maria Sabina, is a cautionary tale for all of us, because after this publication, she actually asked for her anonymity, and she asked for the pictures not to be published, but Gordon Wasson betrayed these wishes and published both. And her village turned against her. She was a very respected healer, and her house was burnt down, and her son was murdered, and Maria Sabina died in 1984 in poverty. And if you go to Huautla de Jimenez now, you'd be hard-pushed to find an authentic shaman, and the magic that was so clearly once there has been kind of overrun by tourism and by this idea of, by a transactional process and people coming and paying for experiences. So this is kind of what can happen if we have irreverent, I don't think actually Wasson's contact was irreverent, but I think it was just what came afterwards. And I think it shows us how careful we have to be when these cultures start to merge and marry, and how much we have to listen to them to form a relationship, really. And now, if you look at the ecosystem, there's, in this boom, there's 24, I think that was the last count, 24 registered patent processes with psilocybin, and none of the companies that are involved in these patents have made any kind of reciprocal agreement with the Mazatecs or the indigenous or other indigenous communities. And so in a way, like these shadows that are looming and that we can't ignore, much like in my training as a psychedelic therapist, if you ignore the shadows, they just get bigger. Like I really think it's time to face them and name them and say that this field and this boom is riding on the back of extraction, cultural appropriation, and biopiracy. Like, I'm going to just call it for what it is. And I know that Andrea, we were talking earlier, and she was like, I don't want to go so much into the shadows, I want to find the solutions. And I think my work has always been about diving into shadows. So hopefully we're going to complement each other. But I think the next question is, you know, how do we avoid continuing this legacy of extraction?
Beautiful. So yeah, the shadows are there. In thinking about the question of what makes good medicine, I was thinking about food. You know, probably raise hands of who likes to eat nice, local, organic food. And if I think of what makes really good medicine, it would be from, I've been doing a lot of work around biocultural sustainability of ayahuasca. It would mean from the vine all the way to the cup and the context, that there's integrity and intention and sustainability there. And I think that when we think about the healing that is needed on this planet right now in the north, that it's in our best interest to think about, you know, how do we truly create pathways for these plants and psychedelic molecules to actually truly do the work of healing. And I think that is through finding integrity in every step of the way. And so thinking about respecting Indigenous knowledge holders, I think when we create a disconnection from the source of these medicines, I don't know how we can expect these medicines to heal a society that's disconnected. Depression is about disconnection. Overconsumption is about disconnection. Climate change is about disconnection. And so if we disconnect from the beautiful cultures and sources of these medicines, then I don't know how we can actually truly seek healing. And I want to be really careful. I do not think we should all be storming down to the Amazon or visiting the Wararika and asking and taking knowledge and hoping that these cultures will heal us. I think we actually have to find our own way forward. And that some of that is by coming into right relationships with the stewards of these beautiful substances that we are engaging with and that are lighting us up to our connection with Earth. And so thinking about, you know, coming into right relationship, I think it is, in part, one of the ways to do that is to continually acknowledge the source. I want to make some distinctions also about some of the path forward. A big piece I have to say today is about the word reciprocity, and I feel like we're using it now in a very incorrect way in the psychedelics world to mean benefit sharing. There's profits that are being made from some of these medicines. I think iboga is a really interesting one because my colleague Ricard and I have been working on a 3-year project to source a vision for the future of iboga, and he spent 6 weeks in Gabon. And the people there that he spoke with and sat in ceremony with, they said, this is a treasure for the world and we want to share it. We just want to be acknowledged. We want this plant respected and we want the benefits shared back. They said, if you're going to come and make ibogaine, come and do it in factories in our own communities or have sustainability issues addressed. So there was a real desire there to share, which I thought was quite beautiful, if there's a deep respect and benefit sharing that comes back. So I think that's very important. I think the crowdfunder for Don Emilio is also a beautiful example. I wouldn't call it reciprocity, I would call it solidarity. The Chacruna Institute has now launched a really beautiful Indigenous Reciprocity Fund that is an example of solidarity, of how do we be in solidarity with Indigenous people in the Amazon when they stand up against oil companies, when there's fires in the Amazon. For me, being in active solidarity is of critical importance. And I'll let maybe Hattie, before I get into my reciprocity rant, maybe you could speak a bit more about benefit sharing, examples of benefit sharing that we can look to that can inspire us for what is possible within the psychedelic sphere.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea.
Oh, you're not.
It's not on, is it? Can you hear me? No. Hello?
Nope.
I know, but
Try
it's
waving
not.
it around in the circle.
Hello? Oh, yeah, better. Okay. So benefit sharing. So yeah, when we think about, when I started thinking about reciprocity, I started thinking about benefit sharing because that was kind of what I'd learned about with ethnobotany. And I started looking around for examples, like surely we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There must be good examples of benefit sharing agreements around the world. And I can actually tell you there are not that many, unfortunately, But there are a couple of examples, and there have been 3 benefit-sharing agreements made with the San, who are the people that I did my ethnobotanical research with. And the one that I think is most relevant today and that I want to speak about is the Rooibos benefit-sharing agreement, which finished in 2019 but started in 2010. So it took 9 years to come to an agreement. Like, nobody's saying this work is easy. In fact, I think that's part of the reason that people kind of shy away from it, is that it's really difficult. It's difficult to identify stakeholders and to get them all together and to get a unified agreement between all these different groups. But that isn't a reason for not trying. And I think with the Rooibos example, what's interesting is that it was done 150 years after after Rooibos was commercialized. So Rooibos tea has been around for 150 years, and then suddenly the San and the Khoi people launched this case for benefit sharing, and they were successful, really successful. So they've managed to get it's an industry-wide agreement as well. So it's not just one company; it's across the whole range, and they've got 1.5% of the farm gate price of Rooibos goes back to the San and Khoi people, to their indigenous leadership councils. This is a great start and really an example of what can be done. There are obviously problems with it in that lots of San people don't have such close relationships with these leadership councils, and how the money is going to get siphoned down is complex and needs a lot of thought, but it's a start, and it's something that we can think about. And I guess this is, Andrea mentioned Shakrina's Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, and that's what they're starting to think about. But I think also the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that you're working with is also trying to think about these things. So do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Beautiful segue. So I've been doing some assessments. So Dr. Bronner's, the awesome soap, I love those guys, and the River Styx Foundation out of the US have been working a lot around peyote conservation for many years, and they are putting together an Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that will be informed and has Indigenous people at the table, and basically will be looking to support Indigenous medicine conservation. I think one of the sad realities of today is that peyote is being over-harvested, iboga is being over-harvested, Bufo alvarius, the toad, is under great threat as well. Ayahuasca, yes, there might be a lot of ayahuasca growing still, but it's being over-harvested in some areas, and the way it's moving around the world is challenging. I think one of the tricky pieces, if you try to map out sourcing ethically of these medicines, is they're not legal. So policy, legalization, looking at criminalization, and creating good policy that will allow medicines to travel that are sourced in sustainable and ethical ways is of absolute critical importance. And so watch this fall, this Medicine Conservation Fund is going to be launched. One of the ideas is, they're looking to raise $20 to $40 million. There's some big donors coming in, but there's also thoughts that if people are sitting in small ayahuasca ceremonies and peyote ceremonies, or working with medicines in other ways, that each circle we sit in could make a contribution to this fund to really support the conservation of not just the plant material, but the cultures behind them, and not the cultures so that we can have some of them, the cultures for their own sake, so that people can continue to live in the balance that they are and resist big mining companies, oil companies. There's a lot of healing and struggle happening in a lot of these Indigenous communities that it's a real honor to try to find ways to support. I think one of the other pieces here, before we can even get to reciprocity, so I was speaking last night with my friend in Colombia from UMIAC, Ricardo Vitale, and he said, we can't, the psychedelics field is pretending you can jump to reciprocity in a time where there's still such hunger for resources from the Amazon, and there's such an imbalance. We can't jump there until we actually can engage in dialogue to look at, with Maria Sabina, what are the wrongs that have been, that have happened in the past, and what do reparations look like? And so my reciprocity rant is that, personally, I think reciprocity, I think we got to witness it in the presentation before, the Huichol process, the Wairarika process of pilgrimage for months on end to say thank you to the earth, to pray for medicine, to be in balance with our environments, that is true reciprocity. And for myself, it's about looking in my day-to-day life of how I'm not in alignment with this idea of reciprocity, and working towards that. And so I think it's like a beautiful and sacred word, and that when we use it to mean we're going to share some benefits back with Indigenous communities around these psychedelics and medicine, I think it's really watering down and greenwashing a concept that is much bigger and much more sacred. And so I think my invitation and my plea is to really be more mindful with the use of this word, because I think it's been co-opted in about 3 years. I've seen beautiful statements about reciprocity on the website pages of some of these companies that I believe that there's good intention there, but I think true reciprocity is not the same as solidarity, benefit sharing, and looking at reparations, all of which are also incredibly important paths for us to follow.
I think I totally agree with you. It's just one part, isn't it? Benefit sharing, right relations, solidarity, all these things are just, all merged together and all have to be thought about together. I think for me, one of the most profound teachings actually about reciprocity was reading the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, that I really would highly recommend you read if you're at all interested in this. And one of the things she says that keeps kind of coming back to me is, if we abandon the gifts will abandon us. And I think it's really about, that is really about kind of engendering this culture of gratitude, being thankful, and with that, reciprocity flows. And without it, we are in danger of the gifts abandoning us. It's kind of like if we don't get our, ducks in line, or whatever the expression is, then we're not going to get the outcome that we want or hope for, and the healing that we're hoping for isn't going to happen. So this sort of brings us back to this idea of, because I know we definitely want to have time for questions.
Now.
So I think that's now. But I just want to end on, and ask you all, what is good medicine? Because for me, that's really about looking at what it is that we want to heal. And as we're a very individual-focused society, and we look at, individual wounds, but psychedelics teach us all about connection and the wider picture. And is healing just about healing us, or is it about healing something bigger? Our relationship with ourselves, sure, our relationship with each other, our wider community, and ultimately the planet. So I think, unless, Andrea, you want to add something there, then we'll open the floor for questions.
Yeah, questions.
Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm from Peru, actually.
Bit louder, sorry. Hold it closer. Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
I'm a medical doctor, and I am an Ayurvedic practitioner as well, Indian traditional medicine for the people that don't know about it. I discovered ayahuasca like 10 years ago, even though I was from Peru, but I was from Lima. Many people in the city don't even know what ayahuasca is. Thank you for bringing this deep topic to discussion of reciprocity. I don't know if I clearly have a question, it's more like a comment maybe. The way I see medicine practice is, I still see it as a colonization of the medical system, unfortunately. I see that basically the modern Western model of medicine that we have, which has some good on it, is the prevailing model, and it's the imposing model, and overriding all sorts of traditional medicines, shamanic traditions all over the world. And for me, now that psychedelics are coming in my country, a lot of ayahuasca, for example, it's great that it's coming, into maybe mainstream or being more recognized, but sometimes I wonder what people are not thinking, that is it not just ayahuasca that they are holding this knowledge, there is so much more medical knowledge and wisdom that they have, that in many ways is even superior to the Western modern understanding of healing. And I just hope that in this topic of reciprocity, which is actually in a way opposing to a colonization sort of imposing model, we can have that dialogue and have a medicine system that integrates all these sorts of amazing traditions and wisdom. So I don't know if you have, that's something that I really want to say, I mean, because medicine obviously touches me very deeply for my background and because I'm from Peru as well. I just want to keep on honoring all this and not seeing being eradicating and more imposing. Because I see most Peruvians, they want to have a modern Western model. That's what they want. That the colonization mentality is still so prevailing that we see our own traditions as primitive and as they should be eradicated and abandoned. Unfortunately, that's the case, I think, in many of the colonized, ex-colonized countries. So I just wanted to raise that topic. And thank you.
Do you want to talk about the pollinator approach?
Oh, you can if you want.
I don't really know it well enough, I don't think.
No, I don't. But I can respond. I can respond. Yeah. Thank you very much for that comment. And yes, this whole idea of how we merge systems of knowledge and how we marry them is kind of central to this conversation and central to, the work I do. I think knowledge systems, unfortunately, we have a hierarchy of knowledge systems, exactly as you were describing. And we talk about kind of cultural diversity, but we don't talk enough about knowledge diversity and the different ways of knowing. And I really think, part of this and broadening the conversation is about really valuing all those different ways of knowing and spreading that, yeah.
Any more questions, just wave your hand to volunteer.
Do you see like the stuffy?
Hello, I'm Z. I'm from a remote village near Tibet. And I have a really funny question. It's like, do you think the reciprocity, like this concept is like really westernized? Because like from my village, like we have lots of like something like a witch, and then we have like just plants and like just when Western people come to our village, we just like kind of like if they want to heal, we just offer it as a gift. Like we don't really think there is kind of like an exchange with it. Like we are parts of the landscape. You stand there, weaken yourself, kind of like that. I feel really like happy, like people feel like there is responsibility to protect it. But do you think it's because the longer we stay in a city, the longer our mind become really limited, and we just think we need to give it back, but actually there was more we didn't see? That's my question.
Beautiful. So the concept of reciprocity, I think it's being watered down. There's an amazing elder in British Columbia where I live, whose name is Duncan Grady. He's US, he's Indigenous, and I asked him, what is sacred reciprocity? And he said, what people are calling reciprocity, bringing a gift for the receiving of medicine, that's barter, and that's not sacred reciprocity. And he said to me that sacred reciprocity is actually what we do with the teachings. How do you walk the medicine in your day-to-day life? How do you have respect for your teachers? And so a lot of cultures, like in the Shipibo, it's actually a Quechua word, aini, is often translated as reciprocity, but it's more about how all the interconnected systems of an ecosystem work together to be in balance. As soon as we make it one-to-one, it loses its meaning. It's not the same as reciprocity, which requires all the systems. So maybe I've benefited from medicine over here, and part of my reciprocity is sitting on this stage today, or making a donation, or working in the community, or living my life in a certain way. I don't think it's as simple as a barter, a tit for tat, or a bi-directional piece. So I think, what you say is quite important, that this idea of trading money for ceremony is something new, that it has shifted things into a different perspective. Thank you.
There's another one just there. Actually, while I've got...
You've got a question?
Hi, I'm Marek. And based on discussions we had on reciprocity, my question is, given the popularity that we are gaining with ayahuasca rituals, how do you envision to change the dialogue or the vision in terms of what we have discussed? Because at the moment, as you've said, it's more like a bargain. People go to these sacred centers, they pay for a ceremony to get something out of it. So how do you actually envision to make that change, given the popularity of it? It's growing, and I haven't actually seen there being a change into what we are discussing right now.
Do you want to take a step?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that question. Yeah, I think my kind of immediate response to that is really something Andrea said earlier, which was about deep listening. I think, part of what we've been doing is mapping this ecosystem and trying to, identify voices and bring voices to the table. And it's for me, it's really about, listening to Indigenous people. What do they think about this? What do they think about this movement? What do they want? What do they see? And and then about being really willing to hear, what they're saying, because I think a lot of times it's like, oh, there's good intention. We want to bring people to the table. That's what we should do. But then what we hear isn't what we want to hear. And then, of course, there's also the piece of oftentimes certain relationships is that what gets said is sort of what people think we want to hear. And so that it's a really long process and long dialogue that needs to take place. That would be my initial response.
That's great.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just to pull off what Alexandra presented this morning, like what kind of psychedelic culture do we want? Do we want to create a culture where people aren't just walking into a ceremony without asking really good questions of whose medicine is this, where did it come from, and being in knowledge? And so with the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, one of the projects that's also being worked on is a kind of a consumer's guide. Can people have greater understanding around the impacts of consuming some of these plant medicines in particular outside of these contexts, and how do we do that in a respectful way? And the answer isn't easy, but I do think, it's pretty cheesy to say, but it starts with us in this room of trying to frame things differently and develop different narratives of the kind of ways we want to think about this, where they don't just become consumer products, where people aren't just drinking ayahuasca every weekend or trying every medicine because they can. It's really being about in greater intentionality about it, and then also, I think engaging in deep listening. And there are some folks who are, involved in different psychedelic businesses that are really working to bring Indigenous people to the table. But I think the question is going to be, what do you do when you don't like the answer that you get? How are you going to respect that? And I think we need to see it as a process. It's all, I think it's part of the bigger issues that we're dealing with as a society, and this is one way through. It's not that psychedelics or plant medicines are going to change the world, but they are giving us an incredible opportunity to engage with some difficult questions around decolonization, around sexual assault in ceremony, around capitalism and commercialization. So let's use this opportunity as a way into some of these bigger issues that are so critical and important throughout the fabric of society, especially in the global north. So thank you for your question.
Actually, while she's getting the mic, I'll ask one. While she's getting the mic over, I'll just ask one. What's your view? Many people say that Westerners shouldn't touch plant medicines that are not indigenous to their own culture and using synthetic chemicals instead. What's your view on that?
I'm going to let you take that.
I'm not saying anything.
That big question. It is an interesting one that... I think in cases like, Bufo alvarez, the toad, where 5-MeO-DMT is synthetic, is available. I think, the toad is increasingly stressed in its ecosystem because of pressures not only on the ecosystem, but of harvesting and the treatment of these animals. That I think, it's really important to look at the synthetics. Myself, even looking at the way peyote, there's been a big debate and discussion in North America around, especially in the US, around decriminalized nature, being asked to take peyote off by by folks within the Native American Church and the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Group, and I think we have to listen. You know, and I was in this conversation with Ricardo last night from Umiak, because they also believe really strongly that the further that yahe or ayahuasca gets from its source, that it's coming out of the energetic field where it does healing and all that deep respect. And so they've actually asked that people not take the medicine abroad, or that that we potentially don't drink yahe. They have, you know, really strong views about this. Then I also said, well, yeah, if I hadn't drunk ayahuasca with someone, you know, some neo-shamanic person, wherever I did that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here with you today and working countless hours in solidarity and support. So it's not an easy this or that, but I think it's really to actually ask ourselves the question, and if someone asks us directly to not do something, and it's particularly Indigenous people who have many other battles. You know, if we look at the Wairarika, who are struggling against mining companies, these greenhouses, and if they have no more medicine left because it's being harvested and used by folks outside their community, is that something we want to sit with? So it's a question for us all to think about.
My question was very related, so stole my thunder perhaps.
Sorry.
But I was just going to ask, we heard Alex speak beautifully earlier about the need for cultural container, and particularly in our culture, where we see these indigenous cultures exist. They have a cultural container. We even see within religious communities in our society that, yes, you're going to be able to go to a Muslim retreat center and have a Muslim experience, a Christian experience, and yet what is that psychedelic experience that is true of our secular society right now? How do we deliver this within the NHS? And I wanted to ask, I know that people like Ros Watts are using like the Celtic tree calendar and some of the work she's doing in synthesis, and we've got all this beautiful data and interesting stuff coming to the fore around the Eleusinian mysteries. Do you think it's possible to have a psychedelic Western cultural tradition, to go to ceremony that doesn't reference an existing indigenous experience, but is a creation, obviously, with respect to where those medicines came from, and explicitly to have a psychedelic experience that is entirely Western in some way?
You get this one?
That's a really good question. It's a hard question. I think we are building, you know, Western psychedelic rituals and Western psychedelic container that is specific to our time and place. But we don't have that. We don't have an alive kind of lineage. You know, I mean, probably somewhere it existed way back when, but that thread hasn't continued. So what we are starting now, I don't think can be isolated from indigenous cultures, because like I said, there's such a clear lineage, and all of us have been touched in some way or had some sort of experience with indigenous people. And so we're bringing that in. You know, I'm on the synthesis training actually, so I'm kind of doing work with Ros on this and looking at, you know, we're using the Celtic tree calendar and bringing in kind of the natural calendar and pagan traditions, but I think it's never going to be entirely divorced because because actually, you know, we are all connected. That's what it comes down to. You know, we are all in some way connected, and we have all the medicines have passed through various cultures and various peoples. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question really, but that's my response.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been seeing that is fascinating about these medicines, there's a beautiful elder in Catalonia named Yaya Pilar, and she first started working with the daime, and ayahuasca, she says, the daime was her route into rediscovering the plants and the spirits and the work of her own territories. So now she's working much more with the local plants, and they're revitalizing the huge amount of culture. So, you know, as more people start to look at their own ancestry or the plants and medicines growing around us, I feel like the gift that psychedelics have brought, and I would say in my own life, is to start looking at my own culture, my own lineage, and also plants, medicines that grow in the lands where I'm from. And so what a beautiful reconnection, and maybe it's happening through psychedelics, that it's actually helping wake this up around the planet, and I think that's a good thing.
Cool. Do you have any last comments or showing?
Do you have any last comments?
Good.
So thank you so much, Hattie and Andrea. And now is lunchtime, so thank you for all of your questions. It's been really enlightening, yeah.